Why can't we just listen to each other anymore, right?
Truly, truly. If we all listened more, what a world it would be.
Back to NEMT experts. I've got Jeremy Scalzi with me today. He is on the board of the TTA, NEMTAC, and he is the Director of Business Development for M7 Ride, which is a long-standing transportation company run by your family, right, Jeremy?
Yeah. So my dad actually started the company in 1987 as a taxi company with 15 vehicles. We're now over 160 with statewide operations in Connecticut.
That is incredible growth. Can you just tell me about the story of M7, briefly from start to now, and your involvement in the company?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in a family-run business, you're involved from day one. But my dad started, like I said, in 1987, and primarily as a taxi company. And this was back in the taxi days, where drivers would really be the main source of their own business. So we run on an independent contractor model, which is an increasingly rare thing these days. But essentially, the concept back in the day was always drivers go out, they get their own business, they start to develop routine customers for themselves, and they might find work at the train station or universities or at the bars downtown. And I'll say that the industry has come a long way, especially with the digitization that's happened. So you fast forward to when the ride shares entered the market. In Connecticut, that was close to 2014. And a lot of taxi companies were forced to really sit down and think, how do I evolve? How do I stay relevant in transportation? And what do we do? The interesting fact about us is that we actually started doing NEMT in 1988. So 1 year after we were founded, we started doing Medicaid transportation. This was back in the logistic hair days. And so, back when the ride shares really entered the market, we made a serious push into NEMT. So we said, what's our niche? What makes us special as a company? And it was helping people. I always say that's our niche, is helping people. So we really doubled down on that and started to focus more on disability advocacy. So my dad lobbied the Connecticut legislature for 12 years until we finally got approved in 2009 as the first wheelchair accessible transportation provider in Connecticut. And so we started expanding those services before the ride shares came into the market. And then we really doubled down on that and started doing direct relationships with hospital facilities, skilled nursing facilities, cancer treatment centers, things like that. And I guess the next roadblock probably was COVID. I'm sure that's a very common term in this industry. So we saw a huge decrease in our trip count and our revenue. And so we refitted our company into a COVID positive transportation company, installed shields, gave the drivers PPE, and trained them on best practices on how to deal with individuals who are COVID positive. And that largely kept us alive until we could resume operations as normal and restructure our business to come back better and stronger than ever.
That is incredible. Like, you guys were literally pioneering NEMT in the state of Connecticut and creating opportunity by, lobbying with the state so that everyone can have the opportunity to do NEMT work in the state.
Yeah, I mean, so NEMT was always an access, but the real thing that was a fight was the right to do wheelchair accessible transportation. So my dad saw this. He always told me this story when I was younger, but he saw this news article of this high school student who had suffered a diving accident in a pool and was paralyzed. And so her neighbors chipped in and bought her a ramp just to get out of her house. And he had this thought as a transportation provider, what next? How does she get to her friend's house for a sleepover? How does she still maintain the everyday lifestyle that she had before she was wheelchair bound? So that's when he started lobbying the Connecticut legislature to gain access to wheelchair accessible transportation. And we've helped thousands and thousands of people connect with healthcare, with everyday services and just be included in society. Our whole motto here is expanding freedom, equality, and independence in transportation. So we always strive to do those three things.
Awesomeness. I want to go back to a point you made earlier, which is about the drivers being contractors. You guys started out this way, right?
Yep.
Can you tell me how that has evolved over the course of the company's life?
Yeah, absolutely. So, over the years, as we've developed more accounts, drivers sort of we wanted drivers to be able to retain their own business development sense and really think of their vehicle as their store, right? So, in the olden days, I would say, probably generate 90% of their business. But now we give them access to benefit from M7's customers and also get their own business. So in the independent contractor model, essentially a driver leases a vehicle and it's their store. Now that doesn't mean that they can't follow state regulations and they have to get the proper permitting to drive that vehicle. But basically what it says is that they're in control of their hours, they're in control of the types of accounts they want to do. So if they want to be an ambulatory driver, completely acceptable. If they want to work 20 hours a week, by all means. If you have people who like to max out their revenue and really give it their go, we have drivers who, like to really drive a lot in weeks and take off more weeks per year. So we lease drivers 1 week at a time and allows a lot of drivers to have flexibility to say, hey, I made a lot of revenue last week. I don't really want the cost of driving your vehicle this week. I'm going to take it off, spend some time with my family, focus on a business that I have. So we've always found that model gives our drivers the most flexibility. We even put out some surveys over the years saying, hey, do you want to be an employee? And they said, nope, we prefer independent contractor because we have families overseas that we like to see, things like that.
Very interesting. I know, Jeremy, you and I had been talking about this previously, but you have some thoughts about how NEMT businesses who may not start off with the model you guys have of contractor drivers can move into that model. And, clearly there are benefits to it, like you've explained. What sort of advice or, guidance would you give to an NEMT business who's thinking about that but just doesn't know how to make it happen?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think if you're a business owner and you're considering what model is better for you, the first question you would probably want to ask yourself is, what level of control am I comfortable having over my drivers, right? That's probably your first starting point, because it can be a little bit worrisome when that your drivers, you've got X amount of drivers who are starting at a certain time at their shift start. So that you're going to be covered that day, and you might have a call out or two, but for all intents and purposes, you're staffed. With an independent contractor model, you really have no control to exert over your drivers. You have to be very careful about how you administer control. That's one of the number one policies for maintaining an independent contractor relationship, is they have to be in control of their own business, of their own hours. So the first thing I would say is certainly think about control and how you want to meet your metrics in terms of KPI. The second, I would say, if you're switching from an employee model to an independent contractor model, talk to a labor attorney. I'm certainly not an attorney, so you're definitely going to want to get some professional advice on what that looks like, especially in your state, given different laws. But really, it's just about hearing your drivers. One thing that I've learned in the NEMT industry is that listening is probably 85% of your job. You really have to listen to your drivers, to your employees, to your customers, figure out what's important for them before you actually make a change.
85% is a lot of percent.
Yeah, well, 85% is strong, but in a fast-paced environment, you should be making decisions quickly. You should be able to adapt quickly. So if you listen 80% of the time, those decisions will become easier and easier to make.
I love it. Keep it simple.
Yep, keep it simple.
Jeremy, let's talk about selling against competition. You have a lot of thoughts about value-driven transportation.
Yeah, absolutely. Traditional providers are put in a situation where You can't really compete. It's a very competitive market out there in terms of pricing. If you're investing in technology, safety technology for your drivers, if you're investing in staff to properly train, credential your drivers, that's a lot of overhead. And you need to recoup that somehow. And that's really where value-based transportation comes in. So, as vice chairman of the board of NEMTAC, what we do there is we basically set standards for the industry in terms of education and, definitions. For starters, you got to start somewhere. And so when we were defining service levels, I kept on saying, this is something that's really important as a traditional provider to take advantage of. If you have a sedan, and you're thinking that sedans can only be used for curb-to-curb transportation, you're wrong. It can actually be used for 3 different products, if you will. So if you're thinking of your transportation company as a storefront, if you walk into your store and you only have one product on the shelf, which is curb-to-curb transportation, you're limiting your market to a very small segment. If you expand those product offerings to include door-to-door transportation, door-through-door transportation, person-to-person transportation, that opens you up to a whole nother horizon that's based on the simple concept of helping people. Even curb-to-curb transportation providers, I'm sure, are not a stranger to going to a door and helping someone, out of the kindness of their hearts. But that's something that you can contract with the medical facility to do and actually get some sort of revenue-based, benefit from that. So I think that that's a really important thing to focus on when you're selling against your competition.
Yeah. It's like when you're going and saying, hey, I want to win private pay work with this facility, it's not just I have a car, I can do trips. Like, here's all the different modes of transport. And I guess you just need to be clear about that with the hospital, that I can offer more, which all the other NEMT businesses in your area, they may not, have resources like, Jeremy Scalzi, right? Like giving this advice, NEMTAC, whatever it is, saying, hey, there's actually these different standards. There's door-to-door, there's door-through-door transport, there's person-to-person, right? And you can say to the hospital facility, these are the different levels of transport that I provide, which forces the hospital to think, oh, this NEMT businesses offers XYZ. The other ones, they didn't even bring that up. This one clearly has more sophistication, which sort of directly helps you sell against your competitors.
Well, it's funny, actually. I heard a quote. I think it was on a podcast about, I want to say Elon Musk, but essentially, is basically about when you're entering a market and you're thinking about who you're selling against, you really have to know the industry that you're in. So as an NEMT company, we're not healthcare, but we are healthcare adjacent, right? So we do need to really understand the fundamentals of healthcare. So terms like high acuity patients, low acuity patients, knowing the differences between the two and understanding how the patients actually want to, or what the patients need. I think the correct term is actually passenger. I don't think as a healthcare adjacent company, we're allowed to say patient. So in terms of passengers, someone who just went through a dialysis treatment, just went through a very grueling process. So you might offer a different service level for that individual versus somebody that broke their arm, who can walk on their own, but might need help opening a door, right? So understanding those nuances and really diving 2 feet into healthcare is highly recommended and necessary for transportation.
Let's dig deeper on this topic of like basically becoming a healthcare adjacent company, right? Mm-hmm. Like as an NEMT business that is healthcare adjacent, like what are all the things that I can do to basically, increase my service offerings and help me win more business?
The best advice that's helped me is listen and ask questions. I would say, for starters, develop a relationship with the local hospital facility or a healthcare facility and just ask questions about what their problems are. You'll hear that sometimes, the majority of the questions asked in this industry are always, where's my ride, right? That's the big one. But once you're there, right? And you might have some resources to help you with getting there. I know Bambi has a great software solution. There's also a lot of other solutions out there. But if you're thinking about just getting there, what do I do after I get there? How do I help this passenger into the vehicle? And you'll start to hear people say, well, you know, I'm a nurse on the third floor of a hospital facility. I've got, 15 patients that I'm working on today, and I might not have the time to walk a patient all the way through a facility and down to the curb to get in your vehicle. And that proposes an opportunity to you to say, hey, I can fix that for you. We'll train our drivers to properly identify themselves at a reception desk, to walk up to the room. We'll have the technology to be able to let you add a trip note when you're booking the ride, saying that it'll be in this unit, in this room, so you know where to go. And that's the sort of relationship that you want to develop, is listening and understanding the needs of your healthcare partners.
It's a little point you brought up earlier, which is like, you can't call them patients in
Yes.
any NEMT. You have to call them passengers. And, we call them passengers in Bambi. We come across this all the time, right?
Yeah.
But the reality is, it's like what you're saying, right? Like, once you're there, that person who is in a healthcare facility is a patient there. And there are things that your driver can do, from them being in that facility to getting in your vehicle, that is treating them more like a patient rather than a passenger. And it's just a matter of listening and, hey, whether it's like providing a ramp or stair chair equipment or whatever, oxygen, there's so many things you could do to help those patients in reality, before they get into your vehicle even. And
Yeah, absolutely. Just knowing, like my mother always says, knowledge is power. So when you're able to really learn and get the knowledge for your drivers, if your solution offers notes, one thing that I'll say is training is a very important thing internally, but also externally. So if you're dealing with a healthcare facility, your drivers need to know a certain amount about the passenger. They don't need to know anything that would violate a HIPAA agreement, but something like passenger needs extra assistance, walking to the vehicle. Passenger has mobility difficulties, may need assistance into a vehicle, or may request a lower standing vehicle. Things like that are great to add and train healthcare workers to provide, because you also need to focus on what you need, which is knowledge about the passenger and how to better help them.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking about, knowing these things about the passengers, right? Transferring that knowledge, into a notes section, healthcare facilities, making sure they send that info. A lot of NEMT businesses, right? Like, you get work from brokers. There are lots of brokers out there. And the way that you get a lot of that information is that the dispatch software that you use has an API connection with that broker, right? And you need that API connection to be sending you all the relevant information about each trip and each passenger to your system, so that your drivers can see, like Jerry walks with a cane, or he requires this level of oxygen. I know you have some thoughts, Jeremy, about how API connections can be developed better among these different kinds of partners. So just wanted to sort of get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I hate to keep bringing it back to listening, but that really is the cause of everything that we do here. So when you're building an API connection,
why can't we just listen to each other anymore, right?
Truly. If we all listened more, what a world it would be. But when you're building an API connection, of course, the first thing you're going to think about is, what do I need, right? So there's the standard set of data that anybody would ask for, which is pickup, drop off, pickup time. If you're graded on both pickup time and appointment time, which is an increasingly popular way to grade transportation providers these days, then you'll need both of those. And then standard passenger information. Another thing to consider is, if you're developing an API connection and you plan on ride sharing, a flag for immunocompromised individuals is an absolute must, because you cannot ride share someone who is immunocompromised. So you need to make sure that you're working with your technology provider to flag for those, and to make sure that your routing capabilities work around that. because again, patient is always first, passenger is always first. So you always make sure that you have their best interests in mind. So when you're building an API, you've got your core fundamentals, and then really the question, the next question is, what does my partner need, right? So if you're going to be graded on things like on-time performance, you need to really get down to definitions. So if someone's asking for a drop-off time, really be clear about what that drop-off time means. Is that the first swipe when you arrive at the drop-off location? Or is it actually when you're on a door-to-door trip, if you drop them off at the door of that facility? So that's really sort of the types of things that you want to be thinking about when working with partners and developing APIs.
Yeah. And it's something we've had to think about a lot recently at Bambi, you know, as we've been going live with APIs with a number of the big brokers. And I mean, the things that you just brought up are just sort of the daily thing that we deal with. And, you know, I know that there are sort of pushes by the TTA and I believe NEMTAC, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but to help the different brokers and organizations out there to develop standards among the data that's sent throughout the NEMT industry, so that you can have APIs that can be sort of easily built and connected because they're all working off this sort of standardized sets of data. And, you know, I guess for the benefit of everyone in the industry, I hope that happens sooner rather than later.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, we all hope so. You know, it's funny when we were developing standards. So at NEMTAC, we have basically committees who are volunteers from the industry, and they volunteer to give their expertise on forming definitions and standards for the industry. Once those standards are approved by the committee, they then move to the board, and then provided the board approves, then we send them to ANSI and we start the public comment process. But you know, developing a simple definition for a pickup time is wildly more complex than you would imagine. If you're working,
right? It's wild.
if you're working with a broker and you've got a broker on the call, you've got a healthcare facility on the call, you've got a transportation company on the call, and even if you had a passenger on the call, that definition would vary tremendously between those four types of people or organizations, because you know, it really is different in different mindsets, and finding a common ground between all of them and setting a definition that everyone can agree on is basically what we're doing. Because if we can all agree on that, then we can all start to measure the success of our industry and figure out where we can help. So if there's bad pickup times in certain areas, some people might be looking at those pickup times differently. So what is the true on-time performance? So things like that will just make our industry better. It'll make it more measurable, and it'll lead to more positive results for healthcare facilities and patients.
There are a few software engineers on our team right now. When they listen to this, they're going to get PTSD.
Oh, I'm sure. I'm getting it right now as I speak. So,
Jeremy, what have I not asked you about that would be good to cover?
What have you not asked me about? That's a great question. I would say as a smaller transportation provider, if you are entering this industry and you're wondering, what do I do? What's even my first step? My first thought would be just engaging with industry organizations. So NEMTAC is, of course, a great resource for education. And if you're looking to set standards for your own company, it's a great way to set those standards. The Transportation Alliance is a great resource. I can't stress that enough on how to do those things, right? So TTA, I've actually, I guess, been a member since I was born. I remember, you know, being really young and going to a conference with my dad and meeting people, and having, you know, been older now, I look back and I thought, man, if I could only have understood the conversations that they were having. But now I do understand them. And that's really the benefit of an organization like that, is you go to these conferences and you just hear stories, right? You listen and you ask. So if you're at an event, you know, the Transportation Alliance is doing a lot this year on new member engagement. So you're at a round table, you're going around and you're listening to how companies do things. You might not want to ask, hey, can you just elaborate on that? Or, you said something earlier about door-to-door transportation. How do you do that in your state? Is there like reimbursement rates for that, for insurance? One thing, I was reading a study about 2 days ago, and it was basically about how states administer NEMT. And there's a very, very vast difference between Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and every other state in how they administer transportation. So given that complex makeup of NEMT programs, people do things differently in different states, transportation providers, brokers, things like that. So if you're in a state and you're hearing something that somebody's doing well in another state and you're thinking it might not apply to me, you can at least take maybe one thing from that conversation as a positive benefit to your business and develop a procedure or something to help you grow. So I highly recommend for young companies to get involved in the industry, really branch your horizons out and listen to the way that people are doing things and take what applies to your business and try to grow that way.
Awesome. And I actually just became a TTA member last month. So I'm excited, to be a part of all the awesomeness that the TTA is doing. I'm putting the links for the TTA and NEMTAC in the description of this video. Jeremy is on the board of both. In fact, on the vice chair of board of directors for NEMTAC as well. An industry leader, I guess, for your whole life. Jeremy, thank you so much.
Run, Bambi, run.
Awesome. Thanks, Jeremy.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me.